Show of Politics. Powered by cable. Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. We're joined now by Reecie Colbert, who's the host of SiriusXM's The Reecie Colbert Show. Welcome to Washington Journal.
Thank you, Kimberly, for having me.
Can you tell us about your show, what you talk about, and the political point of view?
Well, my show is on SiriusXM Urban View, which is basically the Black Talk radio show on SiriusXM. And I call it like the cookout because it is a Saturday afternoon program. And so it's a little bit of politics, actually a lot of bit of politics and a little bit of culture and, you know, current events. So I try to keep it a little spicy, keep it a little interesting. My perspective is pragmatic progressive is how I would characterize it. But I get people from across the spectrum who call in and weigh in on their thoughts.
And then who is your audience? Who's calling in?
You know, my audience is a mix. It's balanced gender-wise. It's a mostly African-American audience, but I get, you know, a mix of people as well. It's pretty diverse. But they're mostly on the Democratic side, but I have a couple rabble-rousers who are more Republican that like to call in and get things a little, you know, riled up.
So you talk a lot about politics on the show. You've written a book about politics, about the midterms in 2022.
Yes.
Can you talk about Vice President Harris's presidential candidacy so far? I mean, what an unusual set of circumstances that brought her to it. What kind of challenges is she facing?
Well, I like to call myself the expert on Vice President Kamala Harris because I've been a supporter of hers for a very long time, going back to her 2019 campaign. And so I've studied her rise from being district attorney all the way up to now. And so really nothing that's happening right now is terribly surprising to me. I think if people were paying attention to the polling and the data prior to her becoming the nominee, they would have seen that she was always polling ahead of President Biden with younger people, with people of color. And so she's benefiting obviously from the truncated campaign. She's obviously benefiting from the rallying behind her, which is something I've never seen. As it relates to VP, you know, she had all these headwinds against her in her presidential campaign, and as being vice president, she was undermined and diminished along the way. And so right now, I think she's really running an excellent campaign, and she has the entire Democratic Party behind her, which is a much better difference than what we were experiencing with President Biden before he dropped out and any other time in Vice President Kamala Harris's career.
You mentioned that you're a supporter of Vice President Harris. Do you have any active role in her campaign?
No, I don't. I am unbossed, unfiltered, so I do not work for her in any capacity and never have.
So can you talk about Vice President Harris's record on some of the issues that are particularly pertinent to the Black community?
Yeah, I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris has always been focused on racial equity in her agenda. We can look at what she did around her 2019 campaign. She hasn't necessarily outlined racial equity things so far in this campaign, but at the White House, I've reported several times from the White House on initiatives she's done, like, for instance, home ownership appraisal bias. We know that the racial wealth gap is largely driven by lack of home ownership or having homes that are worth less than our white counterparts. And so she had a task force that she led up along with Secretary Fudge to eliminate home ownership appraisal bias. That was one specific thing. Another thing is Black maternal mortality. Black women are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than our white counterparts, which is already higher than any other developed nation in the world. And so she has really elevated the issue of maternal mortality to the White House level. And so that's another really important thing. And then lastly, I would say is her work around HBCUs. Not only has she helped secure additional HBCU funding, but when HBCUs were experiencing safety threats, bomb threats, she helped galvanize a multi-agency response to ensuring that HBCU students can be safe on campus.
Talk a bit about her criminal justice record, because that's been the subject of quite a bit of discussion, some misinformation as well.
Yeah, her criminal justice record has been butchered in terms of the disinformation around it. The notion that she was somehow, attacking or as Donald Trump ridiculously said, a prosecutor of the blacks is really ridiculous. She was actually a person who was progressive. According to reporting back in 2003, there's an LA Weekly article that did a deep dive into her career or her candidacy. And she did things like start the Back on Track program, which was really targeted towards getting people of color, predominantly Black men and Latino men, but also women benefited from this program, out of jail, people who were facing, in some cases, 20 years for crack possession. now getting them into vocational programs, getting them into educational programs, things like healthcare, parental training. And so I think her record shows throughout her 20 years of being an elected official that she is not a person who has in any way tried to target or be extra harsh on Black people. She's been about justice.
You mentioned specifically Black men, which have been a really key constituency of focus for both campaigns this cycle. I want to read a bit from an article in the Associated Press about this, which says Black male voters are traditionally one of the most consistently Democratic-leaning demographics in the nation. This year, however, both major parties view Black men, especially those under the age of 40, as attainable voters. Whether Black men turn out in high numbers and to what degree they maintain traditional support for Democratic candidates may prove decisive in November. Talk a bit about Black men and Kamala Harris and what you've seen so far in the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear to both parties, obviously, Black men are the second highest Democratic voting demographic in terms of the margins that they give the Democratic Party. And so it makes sense that both parties would try to target them. I think that the notion that Vice President Kamala Harris has a Black male problem is completely overblown. I think if, the Republicans want to waste resources on chasing that voter bloc, I welcome them to do that. But Vice President Kamala Harris, we've seen data that's come out in terms of the increase of Black voters in their registration since she became the nominee. This wasn't something that was limited to Black women. Black men saw large increases in their voter registration as well. And so I think if we looked at the approval ratings with Vice President Kamala Harris over the years, she's always done very well with Black men. I think Black men will be a core part of her demographic and of her voting coalition.
So then let's talk about Black women. There's an article here in NBC News talking about Trump campaign ramping up efforts to win over Black women with a new video. The Trump campaign is out with a new ad that they released on Wednesday featuring a group of Black women who plan to vote for him. We have that video here. We're going to play it for you and then talk about it.
I am not with Kamala Harris.
I'm not with Kamala.
I am not for Kamala. I am for Donald Trump.
I am not with Kamala.
I am not with her because she is not with me.
I support President Trump and the economic policies our country experienced under his leadership as our 45th president.
President Trump will support our law enforcement agencies and fund them appropriately.
Donald Trump made me proud to be an American.
I'm with Donald J. Trump.
We need a leader who can make America great again.
Trump puts Americans first, and he always will.
We need Donald Trump.
I and millions of other Black Americans will cast my vote for Donald J. Trump.
I will proudly cast my vote for Donald J. Trump as our next president.
Let's make America great again.
So I'm not with her. This is a strategy that the Trump campaign is using to try to distance Harris from the Black community, which was similar to language that he used when speaking to the National Association of Black Journalists convention, where he said that she hadn't always considered herself Black.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this ad and that whole campaign strategy?
It's patronizing. It's not going to work. It's insulting. And it was completely lacking of any kind of substance. I think if we look at the kinds of things that they were saying they were supporting Donald Trump on, things like his economic policies, he left us with an economic mess because he mishandled COVID. They want to bring up law enforcement. Donald Trump is talking about giving immunity to law enforcement officers. You mentioned NABJ. He sat on that NABJ stage, and when he was asked about Sonia Massey, who was brutally killed in her own home by a police officer, he said, that's the one with the water. Essentially, it's insinuating that she brought it upon herself. And he did not back down from his notion that he would provide immunity to police officers. And so we know from data, from surveys of Black voters, that police accountability, criminal justice reform is a high priority for our community. And so a person who suggests that it's okay for cops to kill black people with impunity is not a person who is in line with the majority of African American voters. But listen, we're not going to get 100% of the votes. No candidate does. There's always going to be a percentage of people there. So it's fine to have people who are not with her. That's normal. But I think if this is their strategy to get black people on their side, they're very delusional if they think that's going to work.
If you all have questions for Reecie Colbert, you can call in. Our number for Democrats is 202-748-8000. Republicans can call in at 202-748-8001, and Independents at 202-748-8002. Let's start first with Daryl, who is a Democrat in Florida. Good morning, Daryl.
Yes, good morning. Yes, I'd like to make one quick comment. Everybody keep bringing up Kamala Harris' qualifications. I'd like to make Donald Trump, he's never ran for public service, and I feel like he's an outsider, and I feel like all the messages he put out there is divisive, and she's trying to bring America together, and that's all I have to say.
Your thoughts?
Well, I agree. I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris is one of the most qualified people to run for president. She's already the sitting vice president. She had 4 years in the Senate. She had 2 terms as attorney general, not full terms. She was district attorney. She's been elected at every level, local and statewide, and now federally. And so it makes sense that when you're looking for the qualifications, the credentials candidate, that you would turn to Vice President Kamala Harris.
What about what the caller was saying about former President Trump's record for the black community? What did he do while he was in office?
Well, I'll tell you what he did. He left the black community with 400,000 fewer small businesses as a result of his mishandling of COVID. The black unemployment rate was, I believe, 13-something% or higher when he left office. He wiped out a lot of the gains that we made from the Obama-Biden administration when they cleaned up the mess that President Bush left. And so I don't see where he did anything positive other than saying that he did. He took credit, for instance, for HBCU funding going up. Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was a senator, her and Senator Doug Jones actually were part of spurring the additional investment in HBCUs. And so every place where there was improvement, the First Step Act, a number of things, those were not things that he spearheaded. He may have signed off on it, but he was not behind any kind of racial equity initiatives during his administration, which were very few and far in between.
Going back to the effort to sort of bring more black men over to the Republican Party, Janaea Thomas, the black media director for the Trump campaign, is quoted as saying, "Black men have been taken for granted by the Democratic Party for years, but President Trump's message is resonating at historic levels because he is doing the work." What are the main differences between the two political parties in delivering for black men in particular?
Yeah, I think that, the idea that the Democrats are neglecting black men, I think that's ridiculous. If you look at, we have black men who are serving in the administration and the cabinet. Donald Trump had Ben Carson, who's a neurosurgeon, as HUD secretary. That was pretty ridiculous. Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden have an administration where we have the first black man who is the Secretary of Defense. We also have Michael Regan, who is in the administration. We have key advisors in I'm saying we, because I'm a Democrat, but I'm saying that they have key advisors in their administration that are black men. But look at the economic record. We have seen black wealth go up under this administration, 60% from 2019 to 2022. We've seen record investment in HBCUs, and we've seen a particular engagement with black men where Vice President Kamala Harris, for instance, had an entrepreneurship summit at the White House with a roundtable of black men. And so what Donald Trump has done is that black men can relate to him because he is being so-called persecuted by the criminal justice system. So he thinks he has a kinship with black men because he thinks that black men are criminals. And that's what his administration did, which was over-criminalize black men and not focus on the economic advancements of black men in particular.
Let's hear from Kareth in Florida on our line for Independence. Good morning, Kareth.
Hey, morning. Thank you very much. Now, I live in Florida, and you mentioned something about DEI. And I wanted to bring to the attention of the American people that in Florida, everybody's running away from DEI. And I think it is not serving the country well because we're not addressing the issues surrounding the inequities that have existed in the country. We're living in a country where 98% of its history what has happened is that we said that people of color are not human beings. They should not be educated. They should not be allowed to vote. They should not be allowed to participate in society. And they fought and stood up for themselves against all the odds. And then essentially when the country says, hey, we need to recognize these people, people still continue to disenfranchise them. And you had to pass a Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act wasn't passed to make black people move ahead. It is to teach white Americans that, hey, this is how you act in a civilized, decent manner. This is how you treat people. And even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, what happened? You still had to pass a Voting Rights Act because they continue to disenfranchise people of color.
And Kara, did you have a question for Reecie?
No. So what I'm asking her, I would love to ask her, how does she feel about us addressing the issues surrounding people of color and the representation in the Republican Party? Because deep down, I'm telling you, I'm a libertarian conservative, right? And but however, I vote Democratic because I don't see the Republican Party speaking up for people of color, right?
Let's let Reecie respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, in order to be a Republican in the current day, you basically have to sign up to the MAGA agenda that tries to minimize and dismiss the fact that racism exists. They're not allowed to acknowledge the fact that racism is real, the fact that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is actually something that is advancing and people throughout the country, not just black people. And so it is an important thing. I don't know how people in good conscience necessarily become Republican electeds, but I'm all for representation in any party. But I think if you're going to be there, don't just be a figurehead, actually be a person that's moving the needle forward. And we see less and less of that from Republicans, black Republicans specifically, in this day and age.
Jack in Warren, Ohio is a Republican. Good morning, Jack.
Good morning. Hey, I just want to ask the lady a question about, I'm not an African American. I am a foundational black American, and I wish black women like her. She looks like a foundational black woman, and I would like for her to, represent us right. When Kamala Harris said she's not going to do anything specifically for black America, she lost the black men vote right then and there. This is what we want. We want you black women like you to listen. We want reparations. We want an anti-hate crime bill. We want tangibles. We are not playing any more games with the Democrats. You guys have been running this country for the last 16 years. The last 16 years. And what have you done for us black men, specifically black men? The Asians got an anti-hate crime bill, and all these other groups get all this money. But when it comes to black men, like the people in Chicago and in New York, they're not getting everything. They're bringing in all these Latinos, running our neighborhoods over. And
so, Jack, let's let Reecie respond to some of these points that you've made.
I actually really appreciate this call because this is like the greatest hits of disinformation campaigns that is targeting the black community. First of all, there's no such thing as the Asian hate crime bill. There's the COVID-19 anti-hate crime bill, which simply just added a DOJ expediter to review cases that are COVID-19 related. The black people already have hate crimes legislation. It's called the Civil Rights Acts that have already been passed, as well as the Matthew J. Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Acts. And so there's no deficiency when it comes to the black community in terms of hate crimes legislation. We wouldn't know, for instance, that black people are the #1 victims of hate crimes if we did not have federal hate crimes legislation. So that's a battle that is already won and does not need to be relitigated and fought again. In terms of, Democrats having control for 16 years, we did have 4 years of a Donald Trump administration where we saw the country go into the crapper, in terms of the economic condition, in terms of his handling of COVID. But I'd also point out that you can't hold Democrats accountable for the fact that there are over 30 states that have Republican trifectas. And so when you're looking at where black people are most heavily concentrated, it's actually in states that have Republican trifectas. Democrats are not running those states. And so there was a couple that I missed in terms of some of the things that the gentleman said, but the reality—
He did say that Harris has said that she wasn't going to do anything for black people.
Thank you. That's one of the first. I should have wrote that down first. So that is from an interview where 5 seconds of a clip is taken out of a response in which she was saying that anything that she does, or anything that this country does for Black people, is going to benefit all of our country. So she was not saying that she would not do anything specifically for Black people. She was saying that anything that benefits Black people benefits all of the country. The reality is she has done things specifically for Black people. I already mentioned it earlier, her work around Black maternal mortality and HBCUs and things of that nature. And so I don't know how you can call yourself wanting tangibles and things specifically for Black people when you have Republicans who are doing things like suing the government, or suing this administration, suing so that Black farmers cannot get relief, suing so that things like the Fearless Fund cannot exist, which is help for Black entrepreneurs. I don't know how you reconcile the idea that Black people need to get something specifically, reparations being one of them, where 100% of the people that support reparations in the federal government are Democrats, not Republicans. So I think that there's work to be done, but let's be consistent in our views and in the policies that we're advocating for.
Timothy is in Mississippi on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Timothy.
Good morning, man.
And can you turn down the volume on your TV, please, Timothy? And then you can go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Hold on, man.
Thank you.
Is it down there?
Let's see. Go ahead. Okay, not quite. So you work on that. We're going to go to Rudy, who is in Kansas on our line for Independence, and hopefully we can get Timothy back later. Go ahead, Rudy. Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. Colbert, and to the host. I am an independent voter, and I do not really support Kamala Harris, but this is going to be a protest vote for me. I dislike Donald Trump. I think he's anti-Black, and I don't think he's ever done anything for Black people. And I just want your thoughts on that in terms of he's always talking about he's the greatest president that Black people ever had since Lincoln. And, we've had other historic figures in our history like John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, and other abolitionists. And they're never talked about in this society. So I want you to speak on the fact that Donald Trump doesn't even like Black people. And he's shown that when he got sued in New York in the 80s for not renting to Black people. And these were Black people with money. These were not poor Black people. So he's just lying, and he's a pathological liar. And these people that are talking about they're not going to vote for Harris, we should vote for her just to get Donald Trump out of the way and off the scene. He's just a narcissistic, racist man that just has no morals. He has no...
So, Rudy, you asked for Reecie to respond. Let's let her. Go ahead.
Listen, I'll take an unenthusiastic vote. Any way I can get it. It can be a mad vote, protest vote. As long as you're voting for Vice President Kamala Harris, that's who I support, so I'm unapologetic about that. But the reality is, I don't think that we have to surmise what Donald Trump's feelings are towards Black people. He's already expressed it. I remember in his 2016 campaign, his appeal to us was, your lives are living in hell. What do you have to lose? That was his appeal. And now his appeal this time is, I'm a criminal. Aren't you guys criminals too? Can't you relate to that? And so, and if you look at some of the things that we're seeing now, in terms of the backlash to what people have called before the racial reckoning around George Floyd in 2020, he is the person who put in place the 1776 Commission, which was an alternative to the 1619 Project. And that really laid the groundwork that we're seeing for all these anti-DEI initiatives. I can name a number of things, but the reality is that I haven't seen any evidence that he holds our community in high regard, and I certainly haven't seen any policy to that effect.
Bubba is in Memphis, Tennessee on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Bubba.
Yeah, good morning. I think I heard the lady say that Donald Trump said it was okay for police to shoot and kill Black people. I've never heard him say that. It is a fact that more white people get killed by police than Black people, but of course the media does not cover that because it doesn't fit their agenda. And she just basically lied, saying that Trump said it's okay. Another thing is, we don't even know what Kamala's policies are. She won't talk to nobody. She did that recorded deal the other night, which she had all day to practice what she wanted to say, and she still screwed it up. And Donald Trump was the best president that we've ever had until COVID come along. And Democrats are the one that shut everything down.
So Bubba, before, I want to let you finish your point, but I did want to get some additional details on what former President Trump said at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention about police immunity. So here's a story from NBC. So Trump has been outspoken in his support of police officers, but has gone a step further in recent campaign appearances, calling for nearly blanket immunity from prosecution for officers. When asked about those comments in the context of the Sonia Massey shooting, Trump said he wasn't fully up to date on the case and discussed recent violence in Chicago as an example of why police officers need more protection in courts and in the view of public opinion. Quote, I'm talking about people that are much different cases and that we need to protect that we need police to protect ourselves. And by the way, in Chicago is an example. A few weeks ago, he said, July 4th weekend, there were 117 shootings and 17 deaths. Nobody wants that. We need to have our police officers have their respect and dignity back. I saw something that didn't look good. Trump said that he did not support full immunity from prosecution, but said that the limited time officers have to make decisions should be taken into consideration. Quote, there's a big difference between a bad person and making an innocent mistake, he said. Sometimes you have less than a second to make a life and death decision, and sometimes very bad decisions are made. They're not made from an evil standpoint, but they're made from the standpoint of they've made a mistake. Okay. So, Bubba, that was a summary of what he said. Now, go ahead and finish the rest of your point, then we'll let Reecie respond.
Yeah, he's not saying it's okay for police to kill black people. They do have just a split second to do what they need to do, and more police officers get killed than black people from police. So, anyway, since you chimed in there, I forgot my other thought.
Sorry about that, Bubba.
Well, like I said, the economy was the greatest ever when Trump was president until COVID hit, and then when that hit, Democrats shut down everything, and I mean that's when it kind of went down, like she said, to the crapper. But we're still in the crapper with Democrats in office for almost 4 years.
All right, so let's let Reecie respond. Go ahead.
Well, Bubba, I will concede your point. Donald Trump did not say that it's okay to kill black people if you're a police officer. He did say basically kill anybody if you're a police officer. So that definitely impacts white people disproportionately more than black people. So I concede that point. But the reality is that Vice President Kamala Harris has spoken about her policies. You mentioned the interview on CNN, and so I assume that either you watched it or you're aware of the fact that she has talked about it. She's been barnstorming the country, doing rallies. There was a Democratic National Convention. And so I think that voters who are paying attention to her and actually are interested in her policies definitely have ample opportunity to see that. But as far as Donald Trump being the best president until COVID, what do you mean until? If you are not a good president during crisis, then you're not a good president at all. And so it doesn't really matter what he had done beforehand when he inherited a robust economy. He inherited a gravy situation. It matters how you handle times in crisis. That's what we want from a president, not a person who mishandles it and tells people that they can inject bleach.
Dave is in Omaha, Nebraska on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Dave.
Yes, as long as Ms. Harris is not, I support Ms. Harris, but as long as they keep her from doing interviews and protecting her and such, I think she's going to do really well. I was wondering where we could get those historic speeches, copies of them, on the passage of time and the yellow school buses. I'd like to find those. Thank you.
I'm not sure what you mean there, Dave. But
I don't know. I don't know what that refers to.
Okay. Well, let's go to Mark in Georgia on our line for Independence. Good morning, Mark.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Yes, I am an independent voter. This election year, I am kind of on the fence between both Kamala Harris and Trump. Trump, he's a very unsavory character. If you can get past all of his antics and his off-the-wall comments, he kind of sort of does make sense when it comes down to economics and the money, even though I don't think he's forthright and truthful. And then when I look at Kamala Harris, she is a career politician. But when I listen to her economic plan, it's unsavory by itself. The thing about with the Democratic Party at this point, in my opinion, I do not like how they use race baiting and identity politics to persuade especially African American voters, to vote for them. I feel insulted by that because Kamala, from what I know, when I first knew Kamala, going back into the early 2000s, she was Indian or South Pacific or Asian or whichever term they want to use. But now she identifies with her black side during this campaign, which I don't really appreciate. My biggest issue with her, though, is as a homeowner and as a black male working, I don't see any economic reason to vote for her. When I look at Trump's plan versus capital gains taxes compared to hers, it makes me more prone to want to vote for him, even though he may not, in closed doors, be pro-black. He won't affect my money, my economics. He allows me to be able to make a reasonable gain on my returns of my
Mark,
house.
let's let Reecie respond. You've raised several points there.
Yeah, wasn't really a question in there, but I will say that as a homeowner, I got screwed by Donald Trump's tax plan when he capped the SALT deduction and had a marriage penalty thrown in there for good measure. And so maybe you don't live in a blue state where you pay property taxes like I do, or state income taxes, but his plan was very detrimental to me personally. And so I don't know exactly what your priorities are, but I've seen some comments around unrealized capital gains, things that have been reported that are Vice President Kamala Harris's policies. Listen, if you are not a $100 millionaire, or if you are not a person who gets $1 million of investment income, then you don't really have anything to worry about when it comes to Vice President Kamala Harris's economic policies. She's saying that she will not raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000. That has been true through this administration. If you care about things like child poverty, that is something that they cut in half in this administration. If you care about getting tax credits, if you have children, that is something that the Democrats did for 1 year that was obstructed by Republicans. There's no talk of bringing that back. If you care about things like education, look at Project 2025, wanting to get rid of the Department of Education. And so there are many reasons to support the economic agenda of Vice President Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Just look at where we are right now. 16 million new jobs, the recession that never happened, interest rates are going to be cut in September. And so there are a lot of things that are moving in the right direction. But if that's not the case for you personally, then you're one person and you're one vote and you're entitled to it.
He also mentioned this idea that Vice President Harris has only recently started identifying as black and previously only referred to herself as South Asian, which is not true. But last month on Washington Journal, Michaela Montgomery, who is a Georgia coordinator for America First Works, discussed her support for former President Trump and issues around driving black voters in campaign 2024. And she was asked about comments that President Trump made, which we referenced earlier, at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention about Harris's ethnic identity and how she's identified. And I want to play those comments for you now.
A few days before that, he spoke to the National Association of Black Journalists, and he talked about Vice President Harris's racial identity, that she had become black. A lot of critics said that that hurt him with black voters. What was your reaction?
I don't know why it would hurt him with black voters, because it seems like black voters are offended by everything except the conditions in which their reality is set. So while we might be offended that a rich white man is questioning the nationality of a quote-unquote black woman, that black woman does not claim to be black outside of campaign season. So we saw her be black as she was vying to be VP. The hot sauce on the pork chops, the marching with the band, all of a sudden she's paying attention to her AKA sorority sisters. But then once sworn in office, you didn't see the acknowledgement of her sorority or her HBCU. She didn't wear pink, she didn't wear green, she She didn't wear anything HU. She also did not acknowledge the black community while in office. We saw bills signed for Asians. We saw bills passed for migrants, which primarily affect the Hispanic community. We saw bills passed for literally everyone but black people. So for her, additionally, last thing, after she took that oath of office, she went on record to say that she was the first South Asian vice president. At no point in time did she promote her blackness. At no point in time does she acknowledge her blackness. At no point in time does she market herself as a black woman. And that was when she was attorney general. That's back when she was DA. That's all the way until she was senator. And of course, as vice president. So the fact that, again, she's using this black card during the election season just so black people will turn out to vote for her. And then she will, if she were to win, she would be in office and then fail those same black people who did everything in their power to get her in. I think that's disgusting. I think that's unfair. And I think that that's why I personally reached out to the Trump campaign and asked if I could speak, because I'm like, you guys might be offended when he says it, but what are you going to do when I say it? Because at the end of the day, I am a black woman. I've lived a black life, and therefore I pay attention to politics. So I was actually excited for her when she ran for president the first time. Just the fact that she was in the race, I was like, okay, HBCUs, do your thing. But she never acknowledged said HBCUs. In the first 100 days of the administration, they cut funding to HBCUs. She did nothing to support the very people that she's now leaning on to win this election. And I wish that those same people would understand that if they were to support her in this election and she does win, we will see nothing but a repeat of the last administration in which black people, the same people that everybody touts when it's time to get elected, will also be the ones that are the first to be forgotten about once they're sworn in.
Reecie, your response to those comments?
Lies, lies, and more lies. As my friend Clay Kane would say, there was just a deluge of lies there. It's so hard to keep up. But it's interesting because the last caller said that she is talking too much about race, and then she said that she never marketed herself as a particular race. Listen, Vice President Kamala Harris is a black woman. She has been very clear on that. She said it in the montage at the DNC that she's a black woman. She talked about it in her book. And so there's no question about her identity. But what I will tell you this is about. The number one way that Vice President Kamala Harris has been attacked throughout from her first campaign until now is on the issue of race and trying to drive a wedge between her and the black community, because people have made the calculation that they think that black voters are voting on identity alone as opposed to policies. And that may be the case for Trump voters that seem to have some sort of hang up with Vice President Kamala Harris's racial makeup, or maybe they feel like she's saying it too much or not enough. I don't know. They keep contradicting themselves. But that's a tactic that's just not going to work. And so Vice President Kamala Harris is a black woman. She's of South Asian descent. She's never marketed herself as anything other than a qualified person for any position that she's run for. You don't have to market your blackness. She is black.
Blaine is in Madison, Wisconsin on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Blaine.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My concern is, number one, Kamala diminished truancy in the state of California. I think truancy went up 2,500. I'm not quite sure of the numbers. Secondly of all, with Mr. Trump facing a debate on September 10th, September 3rd, excuse me, and then a sentencing on September 16th and possibly another sentencing on September 18th, what is the emotional presentation going to be for any of the three parties concerned? How do you feel about that?
I don't think we understood your second question. So I understand the first point about truancy in California and the rates going up, but what do you mean about the Trump sentencing? Which parties are you referencing in their emotional state about heading into the debate?
Let's say there's a sentencing guideline and Trump is convicted of 34 crimes. Okay. What's going to happen if there's convictions and sentencing for that? What's going to happen to the race then? Is he still going to run? Will they still allow
I understand
him to
the
run?
question. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, truancy went down under Vice President Kamala Harris's ways that she tackled it as both district attorney and as attorney general. And no, before anybody says it, she did not lock up black mothers for truancy. Nobody was locked up under Vice President Kamala Harris's time as district attorney. And at the state level, when there were reforms put in, the truancy prosecutions actually went down as a result of Vice President, but then Attorney General Kamala Harris's initiatives. Donald Trump has already been convicted of 34 felonies in Manhattan, and so that's no longer hypothetical. The question is whether the sentencing happens as scheduled, which has already been delayed, and the impact of that. Really, Donald Trump can run, he's already running as a convicted felon, and he could run, hypothetically, behind bars or as a person on probation. That is the decision that he has to make, and the Republican Party has already said that they're sticking with him. So I don't know. It's up to the voters to determine how that's going to have an impact on this election.
Barbara from Tampa, Florida says Kamala Harris did not even make it to Iowa in the presidential race. She wasn't voted into this one. She simply assumed the position. What has she actually done to deserve this platform? And deserve is in quotes. Also, President Trump made permanent a commitment of $255 million in annual funding for historically black colleges and universities, and he increased funding for the federal Pell Grant program by signing the Future Act in 2020. Stop misrepresenting the facts.
Okay, well, number one, he tried to cut HBCU funding in his presidential budget, but as I said, we had Democrats in the Senate, and we had a Democratic House majority that did not allow that to happen. As far as the Future Act, he signed a bill. That's fine. He was the president. He was supposed to do that. But that bill would not have happened again without the Democratic majority in the House. As far as what happened in Iowa, that's ancient history. At the end of the day, she became the vice presidential nominee in 2020, and her, along with Joe Biden, had the most votes in U.S. history. And she served as vice president for the past 4 years. When people voted for Joe Biden, they voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. So when President Biden stepped aside, Vice President Kamala Harris earned the support of the delegates. Nobody ran against her, and so she is the properly elected in the sense of the delegates or who elect the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. But if you don't believe that she's earned it, then that's how you exercise that through your vote.
Dexter is in Cincinnati, Ohio, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Dexter.
Yes, hello. I was a Democrat almost all my life. I was in a union. But, you had Clinton, bill, which I voted for him, Obama, all the way up, even Hillary at first. He was giving speeches to bankers and saying everything's going to be status quo. Both parties are funded by the same people, by corporations. Really, we have no real power. They're the same thing. At least Trump wants to shake something up. He wants to shake some tree up. It's not going to be status quo. We've got to get rid of all of these layers of deep state that are totally running our country and running us into the ground. That's the biggest thing, and I guess Kamala will take something up, but it's, with all this immigration, it's going to ruin unions, ruin the lower class, the working class people.
Okay, Reecie.
Well, Donald Trump told a bunch of corporate people at his Mar-a-Lago estate that, write me a check and you'll get anything that you want, in terms of, I'm paraphrasing, so somebody's going to say that's not exactly what he said, but that's what reports indicated, was that he was very, willing to do whatever these corporate people wanted him to do. He's said he's been on record as saying that, to people when he's done, seeing people, like I said, at his country club, that you don't have to worry about getting additional taxes. He gave $5 trillion of tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. As far as immigration, Donald Trump is the one who killed the bipartisan immigration bill. And so he's the one that wasn't interested in doing anything about immigration as long as it benefited him. And so he had 4 years to get a handle on immigration. He didn't get a bill done. He didn't build the wall. And so I don't know where this misplaced faith comes in with Donald Trump. He has the rhetoric, but he doesn't have the record of actually achieving results.
All right, well, that's all the time that we have for this segment. Thank you so much to Reecie Colbert, who is the host on XN Radio's The Reecie Colbert Show. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
And we're going to have more of your phone calls after the break in open forum. You can start calling in now. And later, we'll hear from Anita McBride, who served as the Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. She'll be here to discuss the role of political spouses in the White House and on the campaign trail. We'll be right back.